tell me to appeal my unfair grade? You got it. Many years ago, it's a joke, leave me alone. I was a student studying computer science in the Midwest. While most of my professors were okay, there was one that was notorious. Let's call him Dr. J. Dr. J was an old, effete, lazy professor with a thick South Asian accent whom had been teaching for the better part of 30 years, and had fully embraced the typical semi-retired lifestyle of the tenured professor. Showing up to office hours? Maybe. Showing up to help in a lab? Once, the whole semester. I estimated out of the 3.5 hours per week of lecture time, he was actually in the classroom for maybe half of it, and the time that he did spend in the classroom was a complete waste. He would just pass out packets at the beginning of class that contained numerous diagrams and handwritten notes that were indecipherable, and meander around the class pointing at various parts to groups of people working on them and mumble incoherently about how to solve it. I never understood a word he said. He never followed his course syllabus or even answered emails. For anyone who's taken an engineering course, especially an upper level one, this won't sound too crazy. But here's the kicker, he would fail, regularly, half the class, for a required upper level computer architecture course. This is exceptionally rare and completely unfair for a class at this level, especially at a state school that isn't a research uni. Typically, the interlopers have been weeded out by junior year, so while the rest of the classes are by no means a cakewalk, if you put forth an honest effort to learn the material you should be able to pass the class with flying colors. Not so with Dr. J. Failing a class at the level of this course could be devastating to your degree path since it was a required course. Dr. J was the only one to teach it, and it was only taught in fall. But Dr. J couldn't be bothered, despite the class average for his exams being something like 215. Not that scores mattered because you could get the same score as someone on all the assignments and exams. But you'd fail the class for who the duck knows why. Here's the malicious compliance. Lo and behold, I'm one of the 16 out of 31 students in the class that he failed that semester, and I failed having gotten very similar scores to a couple other students, but they passed. I went to Dr. J's office after the scores had been applied to our transcripts online to discuss the matter. Dr. J wouldn't have any of it. Doesn't matter that I had similar scores to other students that had passed. There's many ways I grade my students and you failed. If you don't like it, you're free to appeal the grade but you won't get it. The fact that the little shit was sitting there in his chair trying to bullshit me pissed me off so dang much. I decided right then and there to duck his shit up. My school has a very well laid out and reasonable grade appeal policy, with many avenues toward getting the appeal approved. I knew that through some of the snide jokes they made, my other professors did not take kindly to Dr. J at all, so it wasn't just the students that strongly disliked him. Well, when you appeal a grade, the other profs in the department are the ones who get to decide whether or not you actually passed, given certain evidence. It's practically criminal. What he gets away with, were the words of my faculty advisor. Now my original plan was for me to just file an appeal and move on, because I knew I'd get it. But Dr. J had poked the bear and now I was mad. So I reached out to everyone in the class, very easy since we all were on a Slack channel together, and set a meeting in a conference room in the library. I guess I underestimated how much everyone hated Dr. J because everyone from the class showed up. I laid out my plan. Everyone files a grade appeal, even if you passed, if it'll help your GPA. At my school, a grade appeal will replace your letter grade with a satisfactory, which means you get credit for the course without a grade that affects your GPA. I had enough appeal forms pre-printed before the meeting so that everyone could fill it out together. It was the happiest I'd ever seen that group of people the entire semester. I think the final count of appeals was something like 22. Everyone whose GPA could be improved with a satisfactory applied for one. You should have seen the look on the department chair's face when we showed up with a stack of appeals. No department in the history of the school had ever had that many appeals/complaints for a single course, let alone for a single professor. I know this because the dean sat us all down and said so. There were so many appeals they had to bring us into the faculty panel in groups of 3 to 4, not that it mattered, the whole thing was a formality as the die was cast. 2 weeks later we heard the news, everyone, literally everyone, had gotten their appeal approved. Dr. J was given a formal warning by the university and had most of his courses taken away and are now taught by other people. He still holds on to the computer architecture course and some freshman intro classes, but from what I've heard, he hasn't failed anyone for a long time. So, if you're a lazy prick of a professor, be warned, you might get someone like me for a student, who foments an insurrection in your class and turns your job upside down. TLDR. Professor gave me a bullshit grade. Made me mad, got the whole class to appeal their grades. All get approved, professor gets formally reprimanded and most of his classes taken away. No longer fails students arbitrarily. Now to the comments. I've never understood when teachers fail half the class like that. Doesn't that make the point that you aren't a very good teacher if you couldn't get half of the class to understand the material? And those teachers who never give A's? Again, aren't you saying you aren't good enough for your students to learn from you? They get so wrapped up in the power trip they lose sight of the fact that they are just proving themselves to be not good at their job. I had a professor who was on probation because her fail rate was so high. Everyone still miserably failed her tests, so she just curved everyone up a letter grade each semester. It sounds like, at least, she knew she was doing a crappy job teaching/designing tests. Some teachers intentionally make the tests too hard and then curve up, in order to assess who is exceptional in the field of study and what they haven't successfully taught the majority of students. I was in a continuing studies class and the adjunct professor was horrible. The first day in class hands out a bell curve that literally said about 4 people would fail. This was a graduate class, no reason for anyone to fail if they do the work and participate. Well, I found out really quick that if she didn't like you, you would be one of the 4. Well, that was me. I took my coursework and emails that I had with her that showed she had a problem with me and went to the dean. I did not fail that class in the end. She was a horrible professor who was teaching a bunch of professionals and thought her way was the only way. She had no idea who she was messing with. That's not how grad classes are supposed to work. If you screw around in one, you get your gentleman's C and move on. I've only had to fail someone in my grad class once, and that was because they essentially did nothing in their group project, and left all the work to their teammates. She didn't get that memo. Everything was subjective, but you couldn't have a different opinion. We bumped heads a lot. I did the work and participated. She just didn't like that I was one of the few who actually had a job and was not a full-time student. She didn't like that I had real-world experience and would speak up. She called me out a lot in class. So much so that other students would ask me if I was okay after her attacks. The only reason I stayed was because that was my last class to graduate. She tried to give me a D, but I got that up to a B. That was my lowest grade. There's a professor at the university in my town who I'm sure sees himself as the last defender of academic performance. There's a particular course only he teaches, History of Psychology, that he has successfully lobbied to make mandatory for honors psych students. It's not even a terribly useful course, because each intro course has a chapter on history, and the more specific courses also cover the history of their own subdisciplines. He proudly announces that it will be the hardest course they will take. He used to send out an email saying many students won't be capable of completing it, but admin made him cut that out. Unfortunately, he only has a rather weak grasp of the subject material, so his lectures are often incoherent and his exams entirely ignore understanding of concepts and focus on obscure details. He's also a creep. Has a long history of approaching students for sex. He actually sent a friend of mine an email talking about their obvious connection and saying how happy he was she was no longer his student, inviting her to spend more time with him.